Donald Trump's steep 50% tariffs on India have kicked in weeks after the US president issued an executive order hitting the Asian country with an additional 25% penalty over its purchases of Russian oil and weapons.
Picture this. Two of the world's biggest democracies, once hailed as strategic partners in shaping the future of the Indo-Pacific, are now at a tense economic crossroads. On one side, former US President Donald Trump has imposed a sweeping 50% tariff on Indian goods, instantly catapulting India into the ranks of countries facing some of the highest trade barriers in the world. On the other side, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi stands atop Delhi's historic Red Fort, wearing his trademark saffron turban, calling on every Indian shopkeeper, every small business, and every household to embrace self-reliance, and proudly display signs reading, "Made in India." It's a dramatic clash of trade power and national resolve, one that has implications not just for India and the United States, but for the future of global trade itself. In this video, we'll dive deep into why Trump's tariffs matter, how Modi is responding, what it means for industries and ordinary people, and whether India's ambitious push for self-reliance can withstand the mounting pressures of global politics. The tariff that changed the equation. On 27 August 2025, Trump's executive order imposing a 50% tariff on Indian imports officially took effect. This move followed an earlier additional 25% penalty targeting India over its continued purchases of Russian oil and weapons, a decision that Washington framed as a geopolitical stance rather than purely an economic one. For India, the implications are enormous. Until recently, the United States was India's largest trading partner, a market that absorbed billions of dollars worth of Indian exports, from textiles and garments to jewelry, seafood, IT services, and pharmaceuticals. Now that trade is being heavily penalized. Experts describe this tariff as being equivalent to a sanction on India, given how restrictive it is compared to global norms. To put it in perspective, India is now among the countries facing the steepest tariffs globally. This raises costs for American consumers, squeezes Indian exporters, and risks destabilizing supply chains that have been growing steadily over the past decade. The tariff is not merely an economic measure, it's a political signal. In a single executive order, decades of careful trade building have been shaken, forcing both policymakers and businesses to reimagine how they will operate in a future where international trade can be transformed overnight by geopolitical disagreements. Modi's call for self-reliance. Amid this economic jolt, Prime Minister Narendra Modi has doubled down on his self-reliance mantra, what India knows as Atmanirbhar Bharat. During his Independence Day address on the 15th of August 2025, Modi, speaking from the ramparts of the Red Fort, urged small business owners and shopkeepers to visibly showcase Swadshi or Made in India signs outside their establishments. His words struck a tone of both challenge and pride. We should become self-reliant, not out of desperation, but out of pride. Economic selfishness is on the rise globally, and we must not sit and cry about our difficulties. We must rise above and not allow others to hold us in their clutches. The Prime Minister's message was crystal clear. India must produce more domestically, consume more domestically, and reduce reliance on external trade partners, especially in moments of uncertainty. This approach, however, faces real hurdles. India's manufacturing share of GDP has stagnated around 15% for years, despite government subsidies and incentives. Boosting domestic capacity is not something that happens overnight. Yet Modi's renewed call for Swadshi aims to turn the tariff crisis into an opportunity for long-term change. His call is both symbolic and practical. Symbolic in reinforcing national pride, and practical in asking people to directly support local businesses, thus weaving resilience into India's economic fabric from the grassroots upward. The immediate fallout for Indian exports. For millions of Indian workers and businesses, the tariff decision hit hard. Industries such as apparel, textiles, jewelry, shrimp, and leather goods, which are heavily export-driven, now face massive hurdles entering the US market. A factory in Bengaluru producing shirts or a shrimp farm in coastal Andhra Pradesh suddenly finds itself priced out in the American market. American buyers facing higher costs due to the tariff may now shift sourcing to other countries with cheaper access: Vietnam, Bangladesh, or even domestic suppliers. This jeopardizes not only business contracts but also the livelihoods of millions of Indian workers who depend on exports. The ripple effects don't end there. India's IT sector, which exports billions of dollars in services to US companies, is also on alert. While the tariff technically applies to goods, a strained trade relationship could spill into other sectors, including services and technology collaborations. The uncertainty itself has created turbulence in financial markets and business sentiment. Exporters are grappling with tough choices, whether to absorb losses, pass them to consumers, or search for entirely new markets, each of which carries risks and requires long-term adjustments to how they operate. Modi's tax bonanza, cushioning the blow. To soften the impact, Modi has unveiled what analysts describe as a fiscal stimulus package, aimed at boosting domestic consumption. Earlier in 2025, his government had already announced a $12 billion income tax giveaway to put more money in the hands of middle-class households. Now he has promised an even bigger reform: a simplified and reduced goods and services tax. GST. The GST, first introduced 8 years ago to replace India's complex web of indirect taxes, has long been criticized for being cumbersome, riddled with thresholds and exemptions. By moving toward a two-tier GST system, the government hopes to make compliance easier and lower costs for consumers. Analysts from Jefferies estimate that these reforms, worth around $20 billion, could deliver a significant boost to consumption. Investment banks like Morgan Stanley argue that tax cuts will help lift GDP growth while easing inflationary pressures. For ordinary Indians, this means potentially cheaper scooters, cars, clothing, and even construction materials like cement. Spending that often surges around the festive Diwali season. The broader strategy is clear. If India cannot sell as much abroad due to tariffs, it must fuel growth from within by empowering domestic consumers. Tax reforms, coupled with incentives for small businesses, show the government's intent to create a buffer for households and industries alike, ensuring the tariff shock is absorbed while creating new opportunities for growth within the domestic market. Market reactions and economic signals. Financial markets, often a bellwether of investor confidence, have responded positively to Modi's announcements. Stock indices in Mumbai surged following the tax cut pledges, and global investors took note when S&P Global upgraded India's sovereign rating for the first time in 18 years. Why does this matter? A sovereign rating essentially measures the risk of lending to or investing in a country. An upgrade lowers borrowing costs for the government and encourages foreign investors to put money into Indian bonds and equities. This provides India with breathing space at a time when external trade challenges loom large. At the same time, India's central bank has already reduced interest rates by 1% in recent months to spur lending. With additional fiscal support, the combined effect could sustain India's growth momentum, even as exports face headwinds. Economists point out that these moves demonstrate India's ability to navigate external shocks with internal policy strength. By aligning fiscal policy with monetary easing, India signals to global investors that it remains a growth story worth betting on, even in the middle of international turbulence. The US-India standoff? Trade meets geopolitics. At the heart of the dispute lies not just economics, but geopolitics. Washington's decision to impose such steep tariffs is tied to New Delhi's continued imports of Russian oil and defense equipment. For the US seeking to isolate Moscow, India's balancing act between Russia and the West remains a sticking point. Trade negotiations that were scheduled to begin in August 2025 have now been postponed indefinitely, as rhetoric between the two capitals has sharpened. Public protests in Indian cities have highlighted the domestic anger against what many see as unfair penalties, while American officials insist the tariffs are a necessary step to uphold global order. This tension underscores a broader truth. Economic tools like tariffs are increasingly being used as instruments of foreign policy. For India, managing relations with both Washington and Moscow, while safeguarding its own strategic autonomy, remains a delicate challenge. The long road of self-reliance. While Modi's call for self-reliance resonates deeply with many Indians, economists caution that building domestic capacity is a long-term project. Despite policy pushes, India's manufacturing sector has not grown beyond 15% of GDP. Competing nations in Asia have outpaced India in industrial expansion, benefiting from leaner supply chains and aggressive export policies. That said, crises often create opportunities. If businesses and consumers embrace Modi's call, India could accelerate investments in domestic industries, from electronics to automobiles, pharmaceuticals to renewable energy. Tax reforms, infrastructure spending, and a young workforce could together push India closer to its dream of becoming the factory of the world. Still, this transformation will require sustained political will, private sector innovation, and global partnerships that extend beyond temporary trade disputes. Global trade in transition. India's tariff struggle also reflects a larger global trend. Across the world, trade relationships are being reshaped by politics, security concerns, and the push for economic self-sufficiency. From Washington to Beijing, capitals are turning inward, prioritizing resilience over free trade. For countries like India, this environment presents both risks and opportunities. On one hand, protectionism creates obstacles in traditional export markets. On the other, it pushes nations to innovate, diversify, and strengthen regional partnerships. India's role in forums like the G20 and BRICS could become even more significant as it seeks to balance its global relationships. The Trump tariffs may sting today, but they could accelerate India's determination to write a new chapter in its economic story, one less dependent on external goodwill and more rooted in domestic strength. What lies ahead for India and the US? The road forward will be closely watched. Can India sustain its growth momentum despite tariffs? Will tax reforms and self-reliance strategies deliver quick results? And will Washington and New Delhi find a compromise to mend frayed trade ties? For now, India is focusing inward, cutting taxes, boosting consumption, and urging its people to embrace local products. The United States, meanwhile, signals that its trade policies will be increasingly guided by geopolitical considerations. What remains clear is this: the US-India relationship, once described as a defining partnership of the 21st century, is undergoing a significant stress test. How both nations respond will shape not only their own economic destinies, but also the contours of global trade in the years to come. And that brings us to the end of today's deep dive. Trump's 50% tariff on India and Modi's push for self-reliance mark a defining moment in the evolving story of global trade. The question now is whether India can truly turn adversity into opportunity, and whether this crisis sparks a new era of domestic strength. If you found this analysis helpful, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon so you never miss our future breakdowns on world events and their impact on economies and everyday lives. And tell us in the comments, do you think India's self-reliance strategy will work in the long run? Or will global trade tensions hold it back?